In our last video, we talked wildly about what happens in the Old Testament. And in this video, I want to talk to you a little bit more about the long process of biblical composition and translation. And this is going to start in about 900 BCE, and it's going to come up into, well, really into the 1980s. So fasten your seatbelts again. We're going to do a scandalously brief overview of how the Bible sort of came into our hands, right? So possibly around 900 BCE, again, moving into the period of the two divided kingdoms in Israel, the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, may begin to be put together from using older traditions, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They're compiling, again, lots of older oral and written traditions. And these are the stories of biblical patriarchs and the ones that come down to us as some of the most vivid stories in the Old Testament to this day. The Pentateuch may begin to be put together around 900 BCE, but by no means is it finished being compiled at that time. It continues on, the process of putting this book together continues on for centuries. Maybe around 400 BCE. So again, I'm leaping forward 500 years. The book of Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, seems to be composed in about the year 400. So though the story goes back to the beginning of creation, and though it covers this vast, shadowy prehistoric time, there's a period of about 500 years, from 900 to 400 BCE, in which we believe that the process of compiling and writing down and editing is taking place. Between 300 and 200 BCE, the Hebrew scriptures are translated into Greek. That's very important because by the time, by this time, and certainly by the time the Christian scriptures come into being, there's the profound Hellenistic influence right throughout the ancient Near East. The Greek is the language in which the scriptures need to be translated, right? And so there is the story of the Septuagint, Septuagint. The story that's told is that 72 scholars in 72 days translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And those books contain what we call the Apocrypha, 7 books that are not actually considered scriptural by Protestants and by Orthodox Jews. And that's because they were not originally in Hebrew. This is the Bible. The Septuagint with the Apocrypha is the Bible that's in use for the most part by New Testament figures when they quote scriptures, and also by the early Christians. So the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures, including some texts that were not originally written in Hebrew, is what we should be thinking about when we think about the scriptures, when we hear them referenced in the New Testament. After the lifetime of Christ, right, after the earthly ministry of Christ, there's a period of consolidation of scriptures. We talked a little bit about in our Zoom session about when the Gospels were put together and when the epistles were being written. Remember, the epistles come first. Parallel to that time, like 70 to 90 after the birth of Christ, so CE, the Common Era, the Jewish Council of Jamnia, Jamnia, begins the work of consolidating the canon of Jewish scriptures, and they reject the Apocrypha. So first couple of centuries after the birth of Christ is a period in which we not only see the Christian scriptures taking shape and being formed, but we also see the Hebrew scripture of the canon of scripture being decided upon in a more formative way. somewhere around 100 CE. We talked about this, that it can be slightly later. The New Testament, as we understand it, is sort of complete, right? In the year around 150, there is a controversy about what to do with the Hebrew scriptures in the Christian faith. And this is a controversy that gets associated with the name of the heretic, Marcion. It's a good name to know. It comes up, you see it often, actually, when people talk about the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Marcionism is the desire to remove the Hebrew scriptures from the canon of scripture, from the Christian Bible, and to say we now have the Christian revelation. The Hebrew revelation is inadequate. It doesn't apply to us. Really, Marcion only wanted to keep some of Paul's letters and some of the Gospel of Luke. So he had a really strong editing impulse here. The Old Testament was too impure, too messy, and much of the New Testament is too in sync with the Old Testament. But early on, right, in the 2nd century, Christian tradition moved toward a definitive inclusion or a definitive appropriation, you could say, of the Hebrew scriptures, and to know our Christianity is not entirely divorced from the Hebrew scriptures. In 382, so I'm skipping over hundreds of years at a sentence here. In 382, St. Jerome translates the Bible into Latin, and much of it is translated directly from Hebrew, not from the Septuagint. So this is a really important scholarly and faithful piece of work, a faith-related piece of work. Jerome stands in the great canon of biblical translators and scholars for translating the Bible into Latin. Remember, it is becoming, in the 4th century, after the Emperor Constantine, Christianity has a really central role to play in the Roman Empire. And now we have Latin scriptures. That's called the Vulgate. So when you hear the Septuagint, that is the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And when you hear the word Vulgate, that's the 4th century translation of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures into Latin. Okay. The canon is formally approved at the 3rd Synod of Carthage, the New Testament canon, in 397. So the end of the 4th century. I'm now moving all the way up to the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1205. Again, we're moving very, very rapidly here. In 1205, the Archbishop of Canterbury in England divides the scriptures up into chapter and verse. They weren't divided that way up until that period. In 1380, the sort of proto-Protestant leader and ultimately martyr, John Wycliffe, and his followers produced handwritten Bibles translated into English. This is, of course, extremely controversial. In the 14th century, the Roman Catholic Church is the Church of England, and it controls what scripture you read, and that scripture is in Latin, and it is wielded by priests. And as you probably know, Protestantism is partly based in, there's a reason that Protestants cling to scripture, right? Scripture is sort of a defining separator between Catholics and Protestants, not because Catholics don't believe in scripture, but because Catholic tradition actually worked against the idea that we might have Bibles in our hands in the language that we speak. So Wycliffe is the first figure in England that we associate with Bible in English, and his followers are hand translating it, hand copying the Bible into English so that it can be read. He is declared a heretic. By the time he's declared a heretic, he's dead. They dig up his body and burn it, right? They are, the English church, the English government is very emphatic that you don't have renegade Bible translators out there because of all the power in the Bible, because the power to translate scripture is the power of the church. And you don't just hand that over to anybody, or you didn't, right? Then. In 1456, Johann Gutenberg invents the printing press, and he very famously prints the Vulgate Bible. Again, that's the Latin Bible translated by St. Jerome. In 1516, we're moving into the 16th century now, and this is Reformation time. Right? Erasmus is a great humanist scholar, and one of his actions is to retranslate the scriptures into Latin. That's known in English as the Received Version, and it's the source for a lot of the King James Bible that comes down to us. William Tyndale in 1525 and 26 prints a new English translation. It's banned and it circulates in secret, and Tyndale dies a martyr. In 1534, Martin Luther translates the scriptures into German. He does not include the Apocrypha, and neither do most Protestants. Right? So when you hear reference to the Apocrypha, remember those are the Old Testament texts that were not originally written in Hebrew and were not accepted into the Jewish canon of Scripture, but did make their way into the Septuagint, which became the Vulgate, which became the Bible that the Catholic Church used. Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, one of his reforms was to strip the Apocrypha away from the canon of Scripture again. The Anglican Church and Episcopalians do count the Apocrypha among the scriptures. You'll usually see them included at the end of the Old Testament under the heading Apocrypha. And you will mostly hear the Apocrypha at morning and evening prayer in the Episcopal Church. That's mostly where we turn to those books, but not exclusively. So just so you know, the Apocrypha do help to form our canon of Scripture, as they do the Catholic churches. In 1535, Miles Coverdale, another Protestant activist who had worked with Tyndale, publishes part of the Bible in English with official approval from Henry VIII. So we're going to talk about this when we talk about the history of Anglicanism in much more detail. But for now, remember Henry VIII as the monarch who not entirely willingly presided over the Protestant Reformation, or the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation in England. And he did give approval for the publication of some of the Bible in English. The Psalms that Coverdale translated are still in use in some Anglican worship, and they'll crop up in ours. Excuse me. In 1536, John Rogers uses Coverdale and Tyndale, the two translators before him, to publish a complete English Bible. It's called the Matthew's Bible because he used a fake name to publish it, because again, publishing a Bible is scandalous. He is, or scary, anyway, risky. He is burned at the stake when Catholic Mary Tudor is on the throne of England. Again, we will cover all that later. In 1539, Henry VIII has the Great Bible published. It's great because it's big in size. It's a big folio publication, huge book. It's a Tyndale and Coverdale combination text. So he's using the previous translations in English. In 1546, the Council of Trent in the Roman Catholic Church proclaims that the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, is the official Bible. So 1546, that's 7 years after Henry VIII has published the Great Bible in English. The Catholic Church makes a sort of response, not only to England, but to the Reformation that is burning around in Europe, to declare that the Vulgate is the official Bible and that Scripture and tradition are both authoritative, which is to say the Scriptures are authoritative in the way that the Catholic Church has traditionally interpreted them. If the Vulgate is the official translation, then the Apocrypha are still part of the Bible, and Luther's translation is out, right? As is the Protestant translation in England. In 1560, the Geneva Bible in English is translated from original languages. Let me put this again. English Protestants in Geneva translate the Bible into English from the original languages, from the Hebrew and the Greek, with the influence of Tyndale and Coverdale. They do not include the Apocrypha, so that's a more Protestant Bible. And it's probably the first English Bible that makes its way to America, interestingly. In 1568, the Bishop's Bible is published. The Bishop's Bible is an Anglican response to the Geneva Bible, and it is less Calvinist. We're going to come back to the Bishop's Bible because I have a lovely little chart about how to profit from the reading of scripture that was attached to the Bishop's Bible, and I think you will find it very, very interesting. The Bishop's Bible is a document in part of some anxiety from the Anglican hierarchy about the possibility that Protestantism takes power out of their hands, right? Because just as Protestantism takes power from the Catholic Church, so it also ultimately threatens to reduce the power of Anglican bishops. In 1582, there is a Roman Catholic translation into English, the Rheims Bible, R-E-I-M-S, and it is done for Catholic exiles who are in France. There is a New Testament in Rheims in 1582. There's an Old Testament published in Douay in 1609, and the Douay Rheims Bible is based on the Vulgate, and it still makes its way in English-speaking Catholic communities sometimes. 1605 to 1611 is the production of the King James Bible, the one that we all think of as the old Bible in English. It's also known as the Authorized Version. It's named after James because it was called for by James, because he called together the scholars and religious authorities to compile the Bible in this way and to translate. It was endeavoring to replace the Geneva Bible in popularity because the more Calvinist Geneva Bible was the most pervasive Bible in this time. It follows the Bishop's Bible, but it improves the translation considerably. And it's done in consultation actually with the Geneva Bible, with the Rheims, with Coverdale, Tyndale, and the Great Bible. So it's really attempting to become the authoritative Bible, the received Bible, right? The authorized version rather. It has lots of typos. It's sort of a fun story. The world of printing and publishing, even for something as official as the King James Bible or the Authorized Version, was full of accidents and mistakes. And so, for instance, the 1631 version of the King James Bible is called the Wicked Bible because it accidentally says, "Thou shalt covet thy neighbor's wife," whatever. The King James Bible hold sway until the 19th century, as we well know, because we still hear bits of it in different occasions. The Standard Version was translated in 1952. It caused a great uproar, the Standard Version, because it translated in Isaiah 7:14, where it says, "A virgin shall be with child," right? They translate virgin as young woman, which is a correct translation. The word can be virgin, referring to lack of sexual initiation, or it can just mean young woman. And the sense of it in Isaiah is pretty clear. It's young woman, not virgin. But obviously that causes tremendous scandal because it seems like it undoes one of the great prophecies about the Virgin Mary and the birth of Jesus. But Christianity carries on even with that act of translation. And in 1966, the Jerusalem Bible becomes the first Catholic version from the original languages, the first Catholic version in English from the original languages instead of from the Vulgate. So you can see the Catholic Church is also partly under the influence of Vatican II, doing some of its Protestant homework and making sure that the people have in their hands a version of the Bible that is shaped more properly by biblical scholarship than only by Catholic tradition. Tolkien worked with them, worked with the Catholic Church on styling the language of the Jerusalem Bible, which I think is kind of interesting. And it's full of great scholarship. So the Jerusalem Bible is a terrific thing to look at. Catholics now use in church what's called the New American Bible, translated in 1970. So if you grew up Catholic, as I did, you might well have been using that version. We use the New Revised Standard Version, right? So that it's going back to the 1952 standard version, but it's been revised. It's the New Revised Standard Version. And that is dated 1989. And so that is our current most up-to-date translation that we use when you go to Mass. That's what you will mostly hear, is the New Revised Standard Version. One more time, just to, because we talked about the Apocrypha, one more time, just to make clear, the books of the Bible that Catholics accept and Protestants don't, and we use, especially in the daily office, are the books of Tobit, Judith, Esther, at least the Greek version of Esther, the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Baruch, some of the book of Daniel, including the story of the 3 young men and the story of Susanna and the elders, and 1 and 2 Maccabees, right? So those you will find if you look at your New Revised Standard NRSV, New Revised Standard Version, you will find those included in sort of their own section in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And if you have one of those combined editions of the Book of Common Prayer and the Bible, that's the NRSV. And when you go looking for the book of Judith, right, you're going to find it not in the Old Testament, but in a separate section between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So that's a helpful thing to know as you navigate the Bible. So that is a really, really quick summary of the long process of taking ancient stories that include, stories of floods in maybe 2800 BCE, as they are integrated into the lives of the Jewish people. And then as they are picked up by the early Christian church, and then maintained by the Roman Catholic Church, and then critiqued and retranslated and re-argued about in the Protestant Reformation. And as ever, the sort of synthesis that we have, which is that we keep many Catholic traditions, but we use the most up-to-date, and what that used to be was Protestant biblical tradition. Now, the Roman Catholic Church is incredibly impressive in its scripture study and does all sorts of really, really interesting work. There's a book, I know that I often recommend Peter Enns, because I just find him a really helpful scholar on biblical matters. The book that I've given you pieces of, The Bible Tells Me So, is written in a kind of accessible, almost kind of bro-y way. And I realize that it's maybe not to everyone's taste, although it is sort of a fun read sometimes. He has another book, the name of which I've now forgotten, but in it, he works with a Roman Catholic scripture scholar and a Jewish scripture scholar. So we have a Protestant, a Roman Catholic, and a Jewish Christian scripture scholar, and they look at select pieces of scripture and they talk about issues in biblical translation and how they work with tradition. If you want to just get a wonderful immersion in competing ways of using the scriptures, that book I really recommend to you. So ask me in person if you haven't figured out what it's called from my halting description here. All right, thank you.